Okay, good evening. Welcome to the main meeting for Silicon Valley asymmetry graph. Tonight, we will have an exciting presentation by Jessica Lee, who is a PhD student working with Ren Ng. Tonight, we will hear her latest research about tetrachromatic colors, which are colors beyond the conventional R, G, and B, which some people can see. I am Alex Junkarek, chair of Silicon Valley asymmetry graph. Before we get to tonight's presentation, let me tell you about our chapter. Silicon Valley SIGGRAPH has been meeting in various Silicon locations, including NVIDIA, Apple, Google, and Intel, for many years. However, since COVID hit, we have moved to online meetings. This year, we would like to return to having meetings in person again, when we are looking for locations where we can host such a meeting. Typically, this requires for an employee of the host company to sponsor the meeting. If having Silicon Valley SIGGRAPH at your company sounds interesting to you, please contact us and help us host meetings at your company. Our contact information will be in an upcoming slide. Now I would like to introduce the volunteers of our chapter. I am Alex Junkarek, and I'm the chair of the chapter. Brent Simon is vice chair. Carl Anderson is treasurer. Sharon Yang is the secretary. And Ken Turkowski is a member at large. Finally, this could be you. We are always looking for more volunteers and need help in many areas of the chapter. In particular, we could use help in finding venues for in-person meetings, as I've said. If you like what you see here, or even if you would like to see something different, please consider joining us. You can find out more information on our website or our meetup page. You can email us at this email address. Most of our meetings are recorded and saved to YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, these links will be in the comments and in the YouTube description. Otherwise, if you want to find this information later, just go to Google and type Silicon Valley SIGGRAPH into Google. Before we begin with tonight's presentation, I would like to tell you about the upcoming SIGGRAPH conference. If you would like to be immersed into graphics 24/7, SIGGRAPH is for you. This year, the conference will be held in Vancouver from August 10th to August 14th, and it's sure to be an exciting time. If you would like to get discount registration, you need to hurry, however, because discount registration ends at the end of May. Now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight, we will hear from Jessica Lee, who is pursuing a PhD at UC Berkeley, working with Ren Ng. We will hear about her work in tetrachromatic colors. Genetic studies have shown that 50% of women have the genetics to express 4 cones in their retina, literally giving them the ability to have a richer color experience. She predicts that instead of the conventional color circle composed of primaries R, G, and B, those people in women who can see these new colors may be able to see 4-dimensional color, predicted as a hue sphere, and composed of something similar to RYGB. Okay. To get more details, let's now please welcome Jessica Lee. Okay, Jessica, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. I am Jessica Lee, and thank you so much for the introduction, Alish. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Berkeley, working with Ren Ng. But today I'll be talking about our work together with other collaborators, Nicholas Jennings and Varun Srivastava. And the title of the SIGGRAPH paper we published last year is The Theory of Human Tetrachromatic Color Experience in Printing. And so let's get started. So since this is a graphics group, I'm going to give a rundown on the basics of color vision in the human eye to get everyone up to speed. And so here on the left, I have a little cartoon of the retina, which is found in the back of the eye, where there are 3 types of cone cells typically, and I've colored them here as red, green, and blue. And they represent the long, medium, and short wavelength cones respectively, shown as LMS. and they're plotted here as a function of wavelength on the right, denoted by the lambda, which is the wavelengths. And so when these spectral sensitivities are then dot producted with the spectrum, they produce a single scalar. And so therefore, with three cone responses, they span a three-dimensional space and therefore give rise to a 3D vision or a trichromatic vision, three-dimensional color vision. However, what if you only have two cone cells instead? And so, for example, here I have a dichromat who is missing the L cone. And so therefore, with two cones, their cone space spans only two dimensions. And this is known as color blindness. And you may have heard that some dichromats appear to mix up colors like red and green. And so let's talk about why this addition of one cone is fundamentally a different color experience. And so when a colorblind individual looks at a rainbow of colored pencils, they see typically only two colors. And so for this type of color blindness, they see shades of yellow and blue only. But now if you have more than one cone becoming a trichromat, you might end up seeing the entire rainbow, which is now segmented into many colors. And so in addition to yellow and blue, we get red, orange, green, and teal. And so it's not just seeing more colors, it's seeing a dimensional boost in colors. And this is the kind of upgrade in color experience that you see going from two cones to three cone cells. And so now the question is, what if you add another cone cell to get a total of four cones? What would that color experience be like? And so this isn't just a thought experiment because 50% of women have the genes for four cones, which is called genetic tetrachromacy. And as you can see here, I've kind of colored this new cone type here in yellow that I'm going to call the Q cone. And this cone is typically found between the M and L cone due to how the genetics of color vision work out. And so now before you think that this is impossible, a color vision research group in the UK pioneered tetrachromacy research by identifying a functional tetrachromat codenamed CDA29. And they verified her genetic potential and visual ability with highly specialized tests. And so it's totally possible to be a functional tetrachromat. But why don't we know more tetrachromats if they are so genetically common? And so there are multiple hypotheses, of course, but first I'll just go into why only women can become tetrachromats first, because it's a point of confusion. And so here I have like a picture from the paper that identified the tetrachromat. And so here on the left, you may see XM and XP. You have an X chromosome from the maternal side and the X chromosome from the paternal side. And so women have two X chromosomes and the M and L genes. So the cones, M and L, the genes for that encode how that cone gets expressed lies on the X chromosome. And there are diverse types of M&L cones, meaning that they're peaked at different wavelengths. And women have random X inactivation. And so in each of the cones in the eye, only one of the two chromosomes gets activated. And so therefore, women actually have the potential to express up to two M's and two L cones. So in fact, they could be genetically pentachromatic. And so but there's not like an infinite number of fourth cones. So the question then becomes, where is this fourth cone and how common are each of these in the population? And we focus on two types of polymorphisms. And so the most common one is the one on the left called Sarah 180 ala. Basically, this genotype confers a 4 to 5 nanometer gap difference between the L cone and the Q cone, and it occurs in about 47% of Caucasian women. And the most likely functional polymorphism is the one that the subject had, named CDA29. And they have a separation of 12 nanometers. And this is likely to be in 1 to 3% of the population. And we kind of model this scenario, the most functional scenario, as is the one that we mainly focus on. And so this specific cone where we have this 12 nanometer gap is what we model as the Q cone. Okay, so getting back to the hypothesis and following the train of thought, the plausible hypothesis is that these genetic tetrachromats are capable of 4D color vision, but we may just be societally unaware of it due to the lack of colors in the environment. Now, basically, if this natural rainbow experience, where when we see a rainbow, we see all the colors that we can possibly see, all the hues except for purple. We are arguing that this natural rainbow experience doesn't really exist. But what if it was manufacturable? And our paper basically provides the theory and engineering for fabricating this rainbow experience. And we provide a method to basically populate the world with these colors, which makes this hypothesis testable. And so we could potentially reveal four-dimensional color perception of some woman out in the world. Yeah, and so since the hypothesis we propose is that there's like a lack of colors in the environment, this claim is supported by a PCA analysis that we did on a hyperspectral image dataset, which is not in the paper. But the analysis in plain terms is that there are not that many colors in the environment that are distinguished solely with the addition of the fourth cone. And so if you do a PCA analysis, you can find that the fourth component, which should be the third chromatic component of the space, it's actually 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the third. And so there's just not a lot of colors that can be distinguished solely by the addition of this fourth cone. And so since these colors don't seem to exist in the world, but we have basically managed to print these colors. And our paper lays the theory and theory of tetrachromatic color experience and printing so that we have the technical tools to go towards testing this hypothesis. And so, yeah. And so one general question that you may have is that do functional tetrachromats see any novel new colors? And I feel like I want you guys to think about it for a second to yourselves. Like, do you believe that functional tetrachromats should see new novel colors? And the answer is that this is like a classic question of many philosophers. The question is my red your red? We can't really know someone else's perceptual experience necessarily. And so this is like a rich topic of interest to many philosophers. And recently there's this new philosophy article, the title, What is it like to be a tetrachromat? And there's 2 main arguments. And the one is that one view is that tetrachromats see finer distinctions in colors, so they don't see any new particular hues, but they can discriminate more colors, perhaps. Another view is that tetrachromats see at least one novel color, which is the one that this author argues. And so today I will also just present my view on this, which is that I think tetrachromats see a geometrically expanded set of colors. They distinguish hues along a sphere as opposed to a trichromatic hue circle. And then really the underlying project goal of this research is to record a conversation between 2 functional tetrachromats to see if they kind of agree on their color perception. Okay. So the remainder of this talk is going to be centered around 3 main topics. So first, on the left, we are going to go through the big topics on the geometry of color experience. And this section will be arguing the structure of their perceptual space. And then we'll go into a deeper dive on the object color theory and its implications. So really getting into the intuition behind the geometry. Hopefully it won't be too in the weeds. And lastly, we'll talk about our efforts in tetrachromatic color reproduction and really hone in on this hypothesis of whether or not if we fill the world with tetrachromatic colors, will we be able to reveal tetrachromacy? Okay, so starting with the geometry. And so here I have an image of one of the figures in our paper, and this is kind of like the key color structures of n-dimensional color space. And so first we're going to focus on the rightmost column for some intuition and talk about like the hue space of each one of these observers. So each row here is corresponding to the dichromat, a trichromat, and then a tetrachromat. And so here I just took that right column and put on the screen. And so I put all the hue topologies for each n-dimensional observer on the screen. And so here in the middle is the normal trichromat, and our method basically predicts that a trichromat sees a circle of hues. And this is well known to be the perceptual organization of hue for a trichromat. And now what about a dichromat? Our method predicts that they will see exactly 2 kinds of colors, blue and yellow, which line up with studies and predictions on dichromatic perceptual experience. And so now we have a dichromat who sees 0-dimensional colors, so only 2 colors, the edges of like a line segment. Um, and we have a trichromat who sees a one-dimensional sphere, which is like a circle of colors. And so, therefore, our method predicts that a tetrachromat will see a hue sphere, which is a two-dimensional shell of very different hues. And every color on this sphere is going to be a new hue. And so let's go into why this is fundamentally a different perceptual experience by looking more into how a tetrachromat would order colors. And so let's take a look at the neighbors of the color orange, for example. A trichromat would always place something like yellow and red next to orange, but they would never say that pink and green are neighbors of orange. However, a tetrachromat would place colors that we see as pink and green, as red and yellow, as neighbors of orange. And so fundamentally, their notion of colors is expanded such that every single color has a color circle of neighbors. Okay, so back to this big grid. So what's the intuition behind why a tetrachromat would see a hue sphere as opposed to some other perceptual experience? I'm not the first person to think of this, and I'd like to thank Coinderic, who is another scientist in this area, for those ideas. And I'd like to take the time to walk you through the intuition on the 3D case, so our regular trichromatic case, on why, we see a hue circle. Okay, so starting with the cone fundamentals, which are here on the left, we're going to generate the reflective color gamut, which is going to represent all of the possible colors that you can see with materials in the world. And you can think of this as just finding all of the possible three tuples of L, M, and S and making a big solid out of it. And so we have this big 3D space, and I want to bring your attention to the most important line in this solid, which is the achromatic line, or the line of no color. And this line starts at black, which is the reflectance that absorbs every wavelength. And then there's white, which is the reflectance here that reflects every photon at every wavelength. And if we draw a line in between these, this is defined as the luminance axis, which represents how bright a color is. And so now a point that I want to make here is that all of the observers, no matter how many cones you have this line inside of their space. Okay, so now we can project all of the colors along this direction in order to get a chromaticity-like space, which represents all the unique colors that you can see regardless of how bright they are. And now in this space, if you choose any color, which is going to be a point, this color can be described by its distance away from the achromatic line, which is something like the saturation. And the saturation metric exists in any dimension greater than 1. And so now what's left from this point is the direction around the achromatic point, which is defined as the hue. And of course, for any particular hue, the point that's furthest away or highest saturation, we call that the hue space. And in this case, it's a one-dimensional sphere, which is a circle. Yeah, so the same derivation that I just went through applies to all the other dimensionalities as well. And so to go over it very briefly for the dichromatic case, on the top here, we have a 2D reflective color gamut. Projecting along the luminance axis, we then get a one-dimensional line. And then since there's only two remaining directions, if we take the maximum saturation of each direction, we get two hues. And so now for the tetrachromatic case, we have a 4D reflective color solid, which is projected along the luminance axis, and we end up getting a 3D chromaticity ball. And then the remaining directions are like spherical coordinates theta and v, so then there's a 2D shell left. Okay, and so basically I just brought that third column that was representing like the chromaticity space, and I'm showing that here right now. And I just wanted to kind of walk through like a distinction, which is that we are basically colorblind to distinctions along the hue sphere, just like how colorblind individuals do not know red and green, for example. So for example here, if you kind of subtract the L cone, you go from having this nice disk of colors, and if you project it along the L direction, you end up getting a line. And the same thing happens with the tetrachromatic case, where when we when you no longer have a Q cone, you project along that dimension and you end up getting that disk going from a sphere ball to a disk. Okay, and so that was basically kind of overview of the first part of the talk, which is talking about the general geometry of color experience. And hopefully at this point, I've sort of convinced you that tetrachromats should be able to see a hue sphere if they're functional.
A question?
Yep.
So do rods not add an aspect of color to all this in some sense, because it's a broader spectrum response curve, or how does that rod, are they just plain discounted?
Yeah, so there's a study on this. Basically, at the mesopic vision level, both your rods and your cones are active. That's kind of like in the regime around like 1 candela meters per squared to 3. And that's a space in which both your rods and cones are active. But there's been several studies on this by groups like Gegenvertner and I think the Brainerd lab as well, who study like color cycle physics. And they haven't been able to study whether or not you are able to integrate that fourth component of the rod um, into like a fourth chromatic component. And I think like my own personal hypothesis on this is that they are meant to operate at different regimes of light levels. And they have different sensitivities as well. Like, for example, there's no rods in your fovea, but there's rods, quite a bit of rods in your periphery. So, like, how would like your visual system integrate both of those information? So I think there's just not a lot of uh, they're like biologically made to operate at different regimes, and there's not a lot of time of the day in which you see mesopically.
So they're looking for motion as opposed to color aspect then, perhaps, right?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, good question though. Okay. Okay. So now there's another. Okay. So yeah, now let's move on to the center portion of this talk, which is on the object color theory and its implications. And so this is going to be most of like the meat of this talk. I'll dive into how exactly I generated all of those aspects that I showed you. Um, yeah. And so this section is going to be divided into 3 parts. So first I'll talk about object color theory, and then I'll talk about the RGB cube and what I call max basis. And then I'll talk about the implications for ecological color of this object color theory. Okay, so first let's talk about the object color theory. Yeah, so we saw this slide earlier with this mysterious reflective color gamut here in this column. The question is, how did we generate that, and how do we generate this gamut from the cone responses? And so it turns out there are 2 steps here. These convex objects, they're first called object color solids, and there's a basis transformation between the 2 of them. One of them is in the cone basis, and the next one is in what I call the max basis. And so how do we generate the object color solid in the cone basis? Well, first, here's an equation for it written down, but this is probably a little bit too much. So first we need to define some basic things. So what is an object color, for example? So here on the left, I have a hyperspectral image of a flower, and this flower is being illuminated by the sun, which is the emissive light in this scene. And then the flower is reflecting some portions of the illumination, which then gets sent as a spectra to like the observer's eye. And so, for example, if we take a look at this specific patch of the flower, we get this spectra. And this spectra can be written as a product as the illuminant and the reflectance, as opposed to just being an emissive color, which radiates power. And so from here, we can actually get the color of that spectrum by integrating the spectra under our photoreceptors. And so in this case, we're just going to use a D65, which is the daylight spectrum, as our illuminant. Now, if we fix the illuminant, meaning that we only consider D65, the daylight is going to be the only illuminant in the scene. then we can figure out all the possible reflectances that can be generated by all materials. So basically, every single wavelength you can reflect any value from 0 to 1, depending on how much that material will absorb and reflect at that wavelength. And so now we can create a set of all the possible colors that come from all the possible reflectances under one illuminant. And this set of colors, or gamut, is then called the object color solid, which is shown here. The equation is shown here. And so there are some interesting properties of the solid. So the first one is that it's bounded, because the brightest color that you'll be able to see is the illuminant, and that will be reflected by white. And the second thing is that it is convex, which is a byproduct of the fact that it comes from the additivity of light. And these two properties together give a notion of a boundary in this space. And so notice that we actually have to generate the solid in order to, represent it. You could definitely sample all the possible reflectances and take the convex hull of this or something, but that's very inefficient and not really a great description of it mathematically. And so, yeah, let's think about whether or not there's a mathematical definition for this boundary. And so the boundary of this convex polytope is composed of what are called optimal object colors in the literature. And the definition of an optimal object color is that it's the most luminous color for that particular chromaticity, which likely doesn't make much sense to you now. In effort to explain this, let's take a look at the reflectance of the yellow flower that we saw earlier and plot it inside of the object color solid. And so that's what we see here. We see the spectra projected, and this is a LMS. This color is represented by an LMS stimulation. And notice that this color, it doesn't lie on the boundary. It lies pretty far down, and yeah, it's not on the boundary. So why is this color not on the boundary? And if we think about points on the boundary, we can think of every single point as having a direction. And so here I'll just click and I'll get the direction of this color. And so I extended this direction until it hit to the boundary of the solid. And so this boundary color corresponds to a spectra as well, a reflectance that looks like the following one here. And so this color is actually the most luminous color of this particular chromaticity being like a ratio of like LM and S. And so if you think about this color, this vector, it has a direction and it has a length. And so that direction is the ratio between LM and S. And this is because, if we multiply this color by something like 2.3 if we multiply this color by 2.3, then we end up getting something that just scales along that direction upwards. And so the color can be represented as this direction and its length. And so the length of this vector kind of corresponds to the amount of like luminous power that this color contains. And so for each direction, we can basically intersect the solid from the origin to like a direction of a point. And these correspond to specific reflectances. And so an interesting theorem that comes out of this is that optimal object colors have reflectances that are d-1 transition functions. And this was proven by Schrödinger in 1921, which was like over a century ago. And so what is a transition function? A transition function is a two-transition function that is an M transition function is an indicator function in which it only contains ones and zeros, first of all. So you can either be reflecting completely or not, or absorbing everything. And the function basically flips from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 at most M wavelengths. And so this example that I showed you here before is a two transition function because it flips from 1 to 0 around like 410 nanometers, and then it switches from 0 to 1 again around 500 nanometers. And so I kind of want to give some intuition for why all of the colors on the boundary will then take this form. And so basically here, if we compare like the spectra that we saw before that we see is down here and not an optimal object color to the one that is an optimal object color. You can see that this reflectance is basically desaturating itself by adding white and black components. You can think of the white component as like the base level of like what's being reflected by everything. So here, at every single wavelength, even at the darkest areas, it's not absorbing everything. It's reflecting a bit of, it's reflecting a bit of photons. And then at a certain point, you're also adding black to the color, which is going to be, it's not reflecting everything necessarily. And so these portions make it not an optimal color because you're basically not being as efficient in this color. So that's why it's not an optimal object color. Yeah. Okay, so, and why is it D-1 transitions? And so here we have this two transition function that has two cut points. And these cut points can basically shift in two directions. So I kind of want to show how it moves in relations to where it lands on the surface of the object color solid. And so, for example, let's move the right cut point, and we end up getting something like red. Yeah, if we move the right cut point, we kind of move along in this direction and get something like red. And then if we move along the edges inside, it actually moves towards white, which is moving towards this point here. And then we also, if we move the left edge over, it kind of wraps back around to the other side. And it gives us a medium wavelength reflectance, which is green. And then if you move this cut point on the left to the right, it also just moves towards white. And so you can see that like, because we have these two cut points and two directions, it can move like in four directions, kind of like how you move on a 2D surface. And so that's kind of like some intuition as to why like a three-dimensional observer would only have two cut points, and those two cut points would explain all the colors on the boundary. And so there's basically a long and famous history of proving this theorem. Shout out to Schrodinger, and then McAdam of the McAdam ellipses, and then Westenbro. But I think a comprehensive textbook on this is the one by Logvinenko. So if you're more interested in this, I would suggest looking at those references. And for a very brief theory on how to prove this theorem. Maybe I'll just go through it very quickly. This is not that important, but it's just something that I think is neat. So basically, how do you prove this theorem that D-1 transition function will lie on the boundary of the optimal object of the object color solid? Basically, every single point P on the boundary has a tangent hyperplane H due to the convexity of this solid. And then, so basically, this point can be intersected by this plane that is tangent, can intersect the spectral locus, and it will basically divide this spectral locus into two half spaces. And each one of these vectors is basically a stimulation ratio of S and L. And since it divides the spectral locus into two half spaces, you can color the ones that are on one side versus the other. And then that basically gives you the canonical reflectances that represent that point. And so that was kind of like a short visual proof on like how to relate the boundary, a boundary point to the reflectances. And of course, there's some conditions on the spectral locus in order to get this theorem to work. But you can refer to the paper for more details on that. Okay. Yeah. So that was the first half of the object color theory. So now I'll get into the RGB cube in rack spaces. Yeah, so we now have told you how to generate the object color solid in the cone basis, but you saw earlier that there's something that looks more like the RGB cube. And so basically, we want to find a change of basis that kind of equalizes the object color solid. And why do you want to do this? And it's mostly because this LMS object color solid, it dedicates a lot of the space to cyan and magenta, but it dedicates almost none to like yellow, green, and red. And this is because the L and M counts have quite correlated responses. And so how do you equalize this space such that like the RGB basis has equal weight? And how we do this is we're going to maximize the volume of the parallelotope that lies within the solid. A parallelotope is just a generalization of the concept of a parallelepiped or a parallelogram. And this idea is based off of something that Coinder came up with. Okay, so to get into it a little bit more, in the trichromatic case, this transform goes from the LMS basis to something like the RGB basis space. And so you see this increase of volume between these two. And the object color solid itself, it's a reference volume in this space because it contains all of the possible material reflectances. And so therefore something that like a basis, a parallelotope would be a good gamut if it has a good volume to object color solid ratio. So for example, something that is like red, yellow, and blue is going to miss basically half of the solid. And so it won't have a good volume to object color solid ratio. But something like RGB, you will give you will cover all of the colors in the gamut. And so therefore, in order to analytically derive this, we can find the maximum volume parallelotope that lies within the object color solid. So it turns out we have two steps here. Yeah. Okay, so how do we find this parallelotope? How do you choose what the parallelotope vectors should be? And so, first of all, I guess the minimum requirements of what you want your parallelotope to be is to have D primaries. So in this trichromatic case, we want to have 3 primaries. And so how do you choose which 3 primaries to choose from? And so we're going to impose 2 constraints mostly. The first constraint is that vectors should add to white. And why should it add to white? Well, if it goes under, then it's always just going to be a smaller gamut and you can't reach the full volume. So that's not a very good gamut. And if it goes over, then it's just not realistic. And the other constraint that you have is that vectors should lie on the boundary. Because if you have a vector in this parallelotope that doesn't lie on the boundary, you're also just missing volume. And so therefore, a good parametrization of parallelotope vectors is actually what I call a departition. And so a departition of a spectrum, it divides the spectrum into D parts. So in this case, for the trichromatic case, we divide the spectrum into 3 parts. And we basically define this by the cut points of where we decide to cut to the next. And so why does this satisfy both of these constraints? So if you cut exactly into 3 parts, then you have 3 vectors that add up to white. Because if you just add up all the reflectances, you get the white reflectance. And so that's a check mark for the first constraint. And then the second constraint is that vectors should lie on the boundary. And so we saw earlier that, that at most 2 transition vectors are going to lie on the object color solid boundary. And so therefore, any vector inside of a departition is going to be at most 2, is going to be at most 2 cuts. And so therefore, all of the points are going to lie on the boundary as well. And so therefore, a departition is like basically a perfect parametrization for reflective basis vectors that satisfy those 2 constraints. Okay. And so basically what we do from here is we basically try all the combinations between lambda 1 and lambda 2, which are those cut points, and then we basically compute the determinant, and that gives us the volume of that particular parallelotope, and we find the one that has maximum volume. And so doing that, we can basically transform. We have the basis vectors now, which are these, and we can basically transform those to the canonical basis, which then ends up getting like an RGB cube for which you can transform the object color solid into this RGB basis, which will give you an RGB cube. And so what's really nice about this RGB cube is that it kind of forms a lattice that helps you kind of figure out what the important colors are on this object color solid. And so I'm sure us graphics folks are very familiar with RGB cubes. But basically we have this lattice which defines the additive components of the space. And so we start with RGB, and then if we add something like red and green together, then we get yellow, and that forms the parallelepiped. And so if we project this lattice along the luminance axes, then we end up getting like a projection of this lattice along the blue and white line, and then we end up getting something like a hexagon in this case. But this hexagon basically tiles the color circle, and it tells us in a binary sequence basically relating to the basis functions. So for example, cyan is going to be blue and green on. It's going to basically tell us this in this binary sequence how these things are ordered together, and tell you where it is most important along this color circle. Yeah, and so of course we already know this for the trichromatic case, but the more interesting case is for the tetrachromatic case. And so we basically run the same procedure that we had before on the instead of having an RGB cube, though, something with 3 basis vectors, we now use it on a 4 partition. And so tetrachromats therefore have 3 cut points, and and they end up with 16 vertices in their parallelepiped. And these are the ones that we ended up getting when we ran the optimization. And now I've kind of listed out the lattice to you in its reflectance form. And so instead of having RGB, we have something like blue, green, and then another cut point here that looks something along the lines from like green to yellow. And then we have something, and then we have red. And then on the opposite, we have not something like CMY, but rather we have something like cyan, violet, pink, and yellow as like our CMY equivalents. And then in between, we have a lot of these other colors that we don't necessarily assign special value to in the trichromatic case, but are important in the tetrachromatic lattice. And I wanted to draw special attention to the ones here that are called Sac and Mao. And the reason why these are important is because you may have noticed that instead of having just 2 transitions, these now have 3 transitions. And they're named this way because this bit sequence of 0, 1, 0, 1 is kind of similar to just trying to stimulate like the M and the L cone only. And then the one on the bottom, which is reflecting more of like the blue component and this like green yellow component, is trying to stimulate mostly the S and Q cones. And so this is a type of reflectance that will basically look very different to a tetrachromat because they have that 4th cone, but to us, they don't look any different from like another color. It's in fact very desaturated to us because it's stimulating all of our cones and not having like a big difference between them. Okay. And so drawing special attention to these 3 transition reflectances once again. In these pairs, you can actually find a pair of these reflectances that look completely achromatic to a trichromat for that reason. Because you can basically equalize the S and M and L responses, but if you have a 4th cone, you can make the Q difference between them very large. And so forms of these reflectances they therefore like make up they make up the two sides of the hue sphere, essentially. And this is basically the extension of like color blindness to the trichromatic case. So similarly to like how a dichromat can't see something like red and green, we can't see whatever these two pairs of colors are to a functional tetrachromat. And so we are colorblind to them in this specific axis. Okay, so we've kind of finished like this max basis derivation. So now we've gone from the cone fundamentals to the object color solid to something that looks more like the RGB cube. And now I just want to talk briefly about the implications of this theory towards ecological color, because I think it's really fun and interesting. Okay, so imagine that you are trying to pick a tomato to eat from my backyard. And you're monochromat. That means you can't really tell which one is the ripe tomato. Okay, but what if you are a deuteranop? This is like the colorblind simulator. You still can't really tell which one's ripe. However, if you're a normal trichomat, you can easily tell which one is ripe. It's the one that is the highest up on the vine. And so basically what I'm trying to demonstrate with this example is like a green tomato, you don't want to pick a green tomato to eat because they contain a poisonous alkaloid called solanine. And then the purpose of like doing this evolutionarily is because it deters animals from picking fruit until they're fully ripe. So the seeds are fully developed. And so therefore, like color vision kind of developed in this very environment of like, these plants trying to signal how you should interact with them in order to survive. And so that everyone can get something either mutually beneficial or mutually beneficial out of each other. And so this kind of concept is called ecological optics. Is the fact that like colors appear out of like this evolutionary interplay of generating and distinguishing different reflectances under daylight illumination, because all of us are, they're mostly the only illuminant that there was back in the day really was daylight or different variations of daylight. And so, therefore, colors basically appear under the object color solid in daylight, constitute the main viewing conditions of all of the animals. And here in this example, I have like, hummingbird that is, interacting with other animals to perhaps mate. And then they also are trying to pollinate flowers, which they use for food. And so these colors are a way of trying to distinguish and communicate in the environment. And so one thing to note is that hummingbirds are actually functionally tetrachromatic. So unlike as we might think as a human tetrachromats, we don't seem to think that everyone, 50% of women are functionally tetrachromatic. And you want to ask why. And so in this study by like Mary Stoddard over at, I believe, Princeton, if you survey your run-of-the-mill hummingbird in Montana, she did this study in Montana, they actually show that like hummingbirds are mostly functionally tetrachromatic. And hummingbirds, like many avian species, they have a UV sensitive cone. And so hummingbirds can tell apart colors that are non-spectral, is what they call them. You can just think of them as kind of like these non-contiguous parts of the spectrum. So in this case, something like a three transition function. And so, for example, this is going to be like a response that is UV and green. And they kind of tested them by applying like sugar water into one that has more UV than red. And they find that like the hummingbirds can visit the one with the UV a little bit more because they recognize that that's the one that has sugar in it. And so it seems like basically any run-of-the-mill hummingbird can basically distinguish the tetrachromatic colors. And why is that? For one argument is that the UV cone is significantly relevant ecologically. For one, because it's an ancestral cone, meaning that it's been around for over 500 million years. which means there's been a lot of time for like both development of perhaps circuitry and also time for nature to generate differentiating UV reflectances. For example, I pulled out some examples of like bird plumage, and you can see that it has like interesting properties. Like this one, for example, it like reflects, like something that's more UV, blue to green, and this one is reflecting something like blue and red, so something like purple for us, but it doesn't stimulate to their UV cone as much, for example. And so there's a lot of like interesting reflectances in bird plumage that look interesting in their tetrachromatic space. And so one question is that how do natural scene cone fluctuations differ between the human tetrachromat and a hummingbird? And so I showed you earlier that like the hyperspectral data set, if we run PCA on the SM and QL responses, that the fourth component is not that significant. But if you run the same study for like a hummingbird, you find that their fourth component is actually pretty significant variance-wise compared to the human, who has 3 orders of magnitude less variance. And so, yeah, this is kind of trying to support the point that there are a lot of interesting colors for hummingbirds to look at, but perhaps there's not that many interesting colors for human tetrachromats to look at. And so really, it's more interesting to try to start testing this hypothesis of whether or not, creating more tetrachromatic colors may reveal tetrachromacy at scale. Okay, so that was kind of the end of the whole object color theory and its implication sections. And so now I'll talk about like the last part of our paper, which was about, tetrachromatic color reproduction in the case for printing. And so I think one basic fact is that trichromatic printers are basically insufficient for printing tetrachromatic colors in general. And the reason for this is because there's only 3 inks, so therefore they can only span a 3D space. And so if we want to fabricate anything that's tetrachromatic, we can't really do it with current printer technology. And this CMY gamut is also orthogonal to the additional cone that these tetrachromats have. And so we're basically unable to print anything metameric. And so the question is, how can we find new inks, or better yet, generalize the idea of CMY to tetrachromacy? So first, we can wonder why CMY is a good basis for trichromatic vision. And so when we take a look at CMY in reflectance space, we can take, for example, cyan and magenta, and if you multiply them together, then since magenta is absorbing in the medium wavelengths and cyan is absorbing in the long wavelengths, then we only reflect blue. And you can do this for every single pair, and so on and so forth. And so basically, we want to select 3 bases that can produce all of the primary additive sensations as a result. And so we basically want them to optimally absorb and reflect light with each other. Like, for example, if magenta were to be slightly more absorbent in the green, then it would end up making, or actually magenta more absorbent in the blue, it would end up making the blue reflectance a lot dimmer, for example. It will like reflect less. And so the fact that they are like optimally absorbing and reflecting at where they cut off is kind of like the important part of what makes good printing basis. Okay. And so how do you derive CMY analytically? Well, notice that we already did that earlier with the maximizing the volume of the object color solid. And what you have to realize is that the object color solid is basically the limitation of the subtractive gamut, because printing is based on subtracting colors, which is based on reflectances. And so therefore, if we maximize the volume of the subtractive gamut, then we should end up getting the optimal printing vectors. And so if we take the max basis procedure that we did before, And then we just take the opponent color of all of them. So blue's opponent is yellow, green's opponent is magenta, red's is cyan. Then we basically get the optimal printing basis as a result. And oh yeah, I drew a picture for that. And so the dual of these basis primaries are going to be the optimal printing primaries. And notice that for the tetrachromatic case, we went over this earlier, but now instead of having only CMY, we have something that kind of splits now, like magenta into two portions, which is like more violet and pink, and they optimally cut off at like in conjunction with each other. And so we want to find inks that kind of behave similarly to these when combined. And on the right here, I'm displaying basically what happens if you use these optimal inks in reference to the object color solid. And they basically fill the entire space. And so now the question becomes, we have these ideas of what the ideal inks should be. But how can we choose inks that are close to these ideal inks? And what we do is we choose 4 inks from a library of fountain pen inks that try to span as much as the tetrachromatic space as possible. And so the details are more in the paper, but as a summary, given these ideal inks, we can basically search through a library of 50 fountain pen inks. And so we basically, actually now we've collected 100 spectrums of fountain pen inks. And we can run a ink gamut simulation procedure in which we basically compute the entire gamut of whether or not, if you combine any set of 4 of these inks, whether or not how much volume it will span. And we pick the one that maximizes the gamut. And we end up with these on the right, which are the chosen fountain pen inks of Epsom cyan, platinum violet is what it's called. We also have peach haze, and we have a Noodler's Operation Orange Overload as like the 4 inks that interact well with each other in order to make a well-spanning tetrachromatic gamut. So these kind of look similar to the ideal inks we compare from the left to the right, but there's clearly a lot of room for improvement. Um, Obviously, because no ink reflects perfectly like these ideal inks on the left. But here, there's just kind of like a summary of our procedure once again. But you can see the gamut here on the right is what resulted from the choice of those 4 inks. So you can see that there's quite a bit of volume on this edge over here. Yeah, that's mostly spanning around orange. And as a result, yeah, we can compare these 2 gamuts. And the point of this slide is mostly to show that this is like what Epson cyan, magenta, and yellow look like in your typical Epson EcoTink printer. And this is the gamut that it fills compared to the chromaticity diagram of the object color solid projected down. And you see that it's not like, it doesn't fill the entire gamut, so sort of like the ideal inks do. But it's like a reasonable amount. I forgot what the exact number is, but I'd say like 25% of this total volume. And so in comparison, like, this gamut is doesn't also looks pretty small in comparison to the ideal inks, but it's still spanning like a decent amount of space. I believe it was like 5% or so, but it's pretty good for, the first tetrachromatic printer that has been ever made. So here's a picture of like the 2 printers that we used. And the way that we were able to do this is we have 2 printers, and we did kind of like a dual pass print where we have 2 inks in one of them and 2 inks in the other, and we kind of feed the paper in through the first printer and then feed the next one to print the other 2 inks onto it. And that's how we were able to print tetrachromatic colors. And so, for example, we tried to print the hue sphere. And so we have the hue sphere here, but then obviously you can't print a 3D object. And so we flattened this hue sphere onto a sheet using the cube map. And then we were basically able to print this cube map, and the ones that are not filled in represent them being out of gamut, as you might tell from the gamut diagram we saw earlier. But it's basically, it was able to print around 50% of the colors. And actually, we took spectral measurements of each of these points and were able to show that it kind of spanned, it did span the tetrachromatic space along that metameric direction. And actually, we have a newer prototype now that covers about 90% of this cube map at a more saturated level at the expense of using 5 inks instead. And so we're also able to print stuff like screening tests for tetrachromacy. And so here you may know the ideal, like the Ishihara test here on the left, where colorblind observers will not be able to read the 74, but to a trichromat, it looks like orange and green, which look like very opposite hues. And in the same way, we can also compute a Ishihara plate for the tetrachromatic case, where they have very different spectral reflectances. So as I was talking about earlier, this one's SAC and this one's MEL, before mostly stimulating the S and Q cone versus mostly stimulating the M and L cone. And we can basically kind of compute reflectances that will be able to show these two same colors, but have very different perceptual responses theoretically. And theoretically to like a tetrachromatic observer. So this is kind of visualized as to how you may have not known that there was an 89 in there, for example. And we were basically able to print a test that does the same thing using our printing gamut. And so here we have the inside color inside of the 89, which looks more pink because it was taken by a phone camera. And then we have the orange on the outside of the letters. But if you see this plate in person, it looks like a lot more similar. And we also have the spectral measurements between the two colors, where they're basically the same for LMS, but have like a difference in the Q stimulation after you project these spectra back into the cone space. And so we were able to print these tests as well. And so that was like one test to kind of test whether or not you could see along this perceptual dimension. But there's another test that exists that's called like more of a hue ordering task. And so you may have heard of it. It's called the FM100. And it's basically a color circle that's separated into 4 contiguous parts. And you are basically told to order each of these contiguous parts in a set. And why is this kind of a good test of whether or not you're a trichromat or not? So a dichromat, if they tried to order the smaller version of this test, which is called the D15, as opposed to ordering 100, you order only 15, like a smaller subsample of it. You can see the one on the right here. It's very disorganized and it doesn't look anything like uniformly ordered at all. But a trichromat who orders it will be able to do it perfectly, like on the left. And if you kind of just pass those two colors into these two images into like Codeless, this color blindness rendering software, you can see that like along two edges, along like something that looked more like green, we see the strongest amount of yellow, whereas the other side is blue. And so they can basically confuse anything across this line. So this gray can be confused with this gray, for example, and they can swap these two. But then that would be the equivalent of swapping red and green, for example. They can't really tell the difference between those two colors. And when they do that, they order it really nicely like this, which looks really homogeneous to them, but it looks like complete disarray to someone like us and someone like a trichromat. So basically, we can also use this cube map that we had in order to create an ordering task as well. But trichromats will therefore confuse colors along this new cube direction. And basically, along this this Q direction line that we saw before, you could basically confuse this gray here with this other gray here, but they're like composed of those two opposite three transition reflectances, as I was talking about before. And then this Q confusion line is basically where the area where you might swap tiles across these two faces, basically. And so we actually made, I don't think this was in the paper, but we made an actual cube map afterwards in which these are like basically Velcro tabs in which you can place all of these tiles onto um, this ball. And basically you have one side of the ball, it's like a little difficult to see, but one side of the ball, there's a gray color that is going to be more S and Q dominated. And then there's going to be the other side of the ball, which is going to be more M and L dominated. And then if you look across those 2 points, you're going to have like a line of points that goes between SAC and MAL dominated colors. And so basically each of these trichromatic hues can be represented with different ratios that will look basically the same to a trichromat, but look very different to a tetrachromat. And so an example of that swapping that we might see is for this like greenish tone, you may like someone, a trichromat trying to complete this task may swap these two tiles because they appear the same to us, but they should appear as like very different hues to a tetrachromat. And so yeah, basically, we've reached the end of this talk. And I just wanted to hone in on a couple of last points. And it's that, after this initial work that was done in this paper, I actually firmly believe that this tetrachromatic rainbow experience is now manufacturable. And so in the trichromatic case, kind of like a rainbow, in which you can see basically almost all the hues except for purple. It's almost coincidental that like all the hues that you can see lie on the rainbow. And we basically made a world in which we manufacture a lot of the rainbow into the stuff that we see every day. And now for a tetrachromat, I think although there is no like natural equivalent through the argument about the hyperspectral projections and whatnot, but I'd like to argue that their rainbow equivalent experience is manufacturable, and it's in this hue sphere kind of fabrication. And so, honing back in on that hypothesis, perhaps maybe if we fill the world with more tetrachromatic colors, we could reveal tetrachromacy at scale. And I just like to end with saying that maybe the tetrachromatic palette is within reach, and that it could potentially, paint the walls of the homes that we live in, and the drawings of children, and also the clothing that we wear. And yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. But thanks so much for your time and attention. And I'd like to just thank Nicholas, Varone, and Ren once again, and acknowledge also the people below for their suggestions and help. Yeah, I'll take questions at this time if there are any.
I had a question. If you wanted to build an emissive device, how would you come up with the emissive primaries as opposed to the reflective primaries? Would a lot of the same concepts still apply? Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, I have. And yeah, I'm currently working on a projector, in fact, that has 4 primaries. And I'm not sure how much I can say about it because I'm submitting this paper on it. But maybe just to broadly cover it in general, maybe like a brief argument, perhaps, is where's the best place for this? There. I have no like true chromaticity diagrams in this talk, but I think like a main concern is that when you choose a primary, you want to choose a primary that is going to span the space pretty well. And so, for example, if you were to pick a primary like blue, yellow, and red, it wouldn't be able to produce green. And so you kind of want to avoid that in the case of a tetrachromat. And like I guess since we have as an industry and as humans, we have developed display technology quite a bit. It seems like almost like well, you'll never make a display that's not RGB. But the fact is that we don't really know what the RGB basis is for a tetrachromat because we don't have access to their perceptual experience just yet. But the way that we've kind of figured it out so far is that you kind of want to maximize the basis of this parallelotope that we saw before. And so doing that, this parallelotope is going to span most of their object color solid. And so therefore maybe something a fourth primary should exist in between the green and the red primaries that maybe already exist that would add to their display should be able to also span their gamut as well. But since it's emissive, there are like a lot of other considerations as well, like efficiency and power. But I think the main point is that this kind of should be able to be applied to a display analysis as well, because for that same reason that we don't want to pick yellow as a primary for our displays, that we don't want to do the same thing for them in which we're missing a large part of their gamut. And so that's where I think this kind of work can be applied in the emissive case. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question. So, is it possible to like build like a tetrachromatic camera then?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And we haven't done any work towards this, mainly because we don't think that there is a lot of tetrachromatic colors out in the wild. But you could imagine that you have something like a fourth color filter that's sensitive to more of like in between green and red. So like a two transition kind of pass through a bandpass in that zone. And then you could engineer something that works well with the display then in order to reproduce all of the colors. But we haven't really put too much work into that yet, but that is something that we want to do. Yeah.
Okay. I was also wondering, is your lab been able to identify any like tetrachromatic people or?
Yeah, so the problem with this is mostly that it's kind of rare for a functional tetrachromat to exist. People have tried before, and we are currently attempting to recruit people to come to our lab to look at our projector that we've made because the reason why we didn't do it so much with the printer is because the printer is difficult, as you can imagine. You have to pass a paper through twice through the printer in order to get it to print well. And then our gamut wasn't very large either. And so it's nice to have a display because the stimuli you can adjust on the fly to really test if someone is tetrachromatic or not. And so basically, we have been working on building a portable projector that we hope to send to a museum this summer so that people can view it and perhaps take a test themselves. Yeah. So no, we have not yet identified anyone, but yes, it is in the works and we are working towards that. As you know, it is my research goal to identify two of them so that we can understand their perceptual experience better. Yeah, I see a question in the Q&A. Any thoughts on how monitors would have to be redesigned per pixel? Yeah, I actually I met someone recently who manufactures quantum dots. And I was thinking, oh, it would be interesting if we had a fourth quantum dot that is, somewhere emissive around like 590 nanometers or so to become tetrachromatic. But I'm not really sure like about the actual display design itself, whether or not how many of these do you need per pixel, for example, because I'm sure there's a lot of other considerations like luminance and like white balance that play into, the actual design of the monitor. So as far as I know right now, like I don't know any further details in that monitor direction, but since we do have a projector, we've just been like time multiplexing like the display of 4 different LEDs at the moment in order to show tetrachromatic stimuli.
Did you want to say anything about the new color that's been in the press a lot lately, with the lasers pointing at the receptors?
Yeah, so those are my lab mates. And yeah, maybe I can just explain briefly about their project. So as you can see here, the M cone is pretty highly correlated with the L cone, and the M cone can never be stimulated on its own naturally. So for example, at every single wavelength, the M cone is always being stimulated with another cone. And so what Ren and James and Hannah, the authors of that paper, have been doing is instead of looking at like natural spectra, you can actually aim a laser at the retina such that you can only stimulate the cone cells here that are green. And what happens when you elicit that sensation is that compared to any spectral primary on the spectral locus. So if you were to take like any sort of color that is basically like a direct delta on the spectral locus, that M-only stimulus in the eye actually looks more saturated than any spectral color. And so that's kind of like what they did in their work, and has been all hot in the press. And the reason why it's kind of like a new color is because it has unprecedented saturation, according to the people who viewed it and do this like test of comparing it to a spectral color. Yeah.
Dr. Lee, this is Greg Weinstein. I seem to recall that Fujifilm developed an image sensor about 10 years ago that had 4 primary colors. I seem to recall that they had divided the green spectrum into 2 different cells. So instead of RGBG, it would be RG1, BG2. They were talking about how it would increase the total gamut and the accuracy and brilliance of the colors. And they were demonstrating projecting images taken with that sensor at the Consumer Electronics Show. Do you know anything about this? And is their chip still available to scientists like yourself?
Yeah, so I don't know about Fujifilm, but I do know that Sony has a tetrachromatic camera and that has a similar design, just as you described. It splits the G channel into 2. It actually has a cyan filter on it. And so we actually have that camera in our lab because we were trying to use it to collect tetrachromatic imagery. Another lab mate was, at least. And they found that basically since the cyan, like it almost heavily overlapped. It was like more sensitive than the green. And because they weren't that linearly independent, it wasn't able to be used as a tetrachromatic camera for our use cases. But nonetheless, it is interesting to still further think about whether or not that camera could be useful for other means. Yeah, I didn't personally work on that. My lab mate did, but we are actively looking into, considering this camera again to kind of think about what a good tetrachromatic camera would be. Yeah.
In line with Greg's question about previous products that have been using more colors, I think about 2 decades ago, I'm not sure it was Epson or Canon, had demonstrated a printer that had 4 colors. And I think besides the fourth color was orange. Um, would that have anything to do with tetrachromatism?
Oh,
Or is that, I think they were saying they just wanted to get a fuller gamut. Do you know anything about that?
yeah, I don't know anything about that particular printer, but I do have a guess, which is that that orange color is probably used as like a spot color to more accurately represent possibly skin tone, because I know that was always like a color calibration effort in these early color reproduction technologies, like film,
Uh-huh.
for example. Like film was always trying to calibrate their CMY inside in order to capture skin tone more accurately. And so my guess is that that orange fourth um, printing primary is used as like a way to sort of color correct in some cases. Um, so
Hmm.
the fact that it's orange, it gives me a hint that it's not exactly reflecting as much color as like a yellow. A yellow is like very reflective. Let me
Hmm.
give an example of yellow versus orange. Yeah, like something like orange
Hmm.
here. It's kind of like reflecting half of what like a yellow would be reflecting, which I guess is down here. And so
Hmm.
it seems like this, if you were to add this orange primary and you add it with something like cyan, yellow, and like magenta already, it just seems like that that could make an okay tetrachromatic printer, but
Basis.
it wouldn't be the ideal basis.
Hmm.
Like I guess in our printer we actually use quite a bit of orange inks, and I think the reason why we do why the solution ended up that way is because they're kind of like this violet cut point is like here, and then this peach haze cut point is like about here, and so you could presumably connect these two, you multiply these two together, and then you get something that stimulates around orange like this. And that would be like a very Q dominant color, perhaps. And I think that's kind of why. And then you can compare that orange color with like this noodler's orange, for example. And those two colors will look very similar to us, but then it would elicit a different reaction in a tetrachromatic individual, which is probably why like our best t creation of a test was actually this orange hue. So yeah, sorry, I was rambling a little bit, but it seems
No,
like
no,
yeah.
it's interesting to hear your thought process. I had one more question of clarification.
Sure.
In one of your first few slides, you mentioned something about 50% of women, and then another one with something like 2% of women. I think the 2% had something to do with a 12 millimeter gap
Mhm.
in a spectrum, and the other one more like 5 or something.
Yeah.
And you sort of implied that your experiments were done with the 2%. Is that correct?
Uh, it's more of my all of my analysis has been done with this particular cone fundamental that has a 12 nanometer gap. And that's mostly because the most likely functional tetrachromat has this genotype.
But so I guess I'm not sure what functional versus common. You mean functional is someone who can actually discriminate, whereas common is, they can't really discriminate. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I don't want to exactly say that because, we're not sure if this scenario in which you have 4 to 5 nanometers disqualifies you from being functional because that may not be the case. It may just be that, there's not a lot of colors out in the wild that people look at when they like grow up, so they don't really learn this distinction. Like there's a lot of hypotheses on why, women don't become tetrachromatic, and I kind of outlined, an ecological argument to that, at least with like comparison to the hummingbird. And so, this 4 to 5 nanometer gap, I mean, if you imagine sort of how much contrast you would need in between the Q cone and the other cones in order to kind of only stimulate that cone. Kind of like, I don't know, the OLO system. If you can only stimulate the Q cone, then I'm sure like someone could learn to distinguish that fourth cone away from the other cones. But since they're so highly correlated, and a lot of like natural scenes are also very correlated in the amino direction, it seems usually a little bit more unlikely. But the person that they actually found who was functionally tetrachromatic, she had the genotype on the right, where she had like the maximally spaced one in between the M and the L cone. And so we kind of just talk about that one as being the most likely functional case because that's the only genotype in which the functional tetrachromat has been found. But even then, even if you have this genotype, it doesn't necessarily confer that you have functional tetrachromacy either. Yeah, I think this is my personal opinion, but I think that you have to see like interesting tetrachromatic colors as you're growing up in order to learn the distinguishment between this. Because you can think of like a thought of experiment as like a trichromat. If we grow up in a dichromatic world, would we still be trichromatic?
I have a question that may be a little bit off base, but apparently the idea that carrots improve eyesight doesn't really help. I was a World War II propaganda. But is there something that actually can like improve enlarge the response curves of any of these things, or is there anything like that that's thought about?
It's an interesting question. I think I think if you eat a lot of carrots, it may affect your macular pigment.
Well, apparently, I guess it was a World War II propaganda thing to say how much of effect it really had. So they were hiding the fact that they were using radar to find the planes as opposed to people seeing them sooner. So that I just learned that part. But I had heard that there was some experiment they did in World War II with conscientious objectors and fed them lots of carrots. But I guess maybe the truth has come out since then. But I didn't know if there's something else that you've heard of, in terms of enhancing the response.
Yeah, the only thing I know is that if you drink carrot juice the day before doing psychophysics, it may skew how you perceive blue because you may end up absorbing more blue light. But I don't know anything beyond that.
I seem to recall that with the multi-tank Epson, that there was one model printer that had 6 or 7 tanks. And I seem to remember that there were third parties that made custom inks to go in those. For instance, I've actually seen a demonstration of one that had like 6 different shades of gray and that could print gravure quality photographs on the right paper, of course, on the Epson. Have you checked into, are there third-party vendors that actually make the 2 different shades of green that might allow you to simulate close enough the colors of Q?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great thought. We have not really checked with third-party vendors if they can manufacture something specific to us yet. When we did this project, it was mostly my other 2 authors are the ones who mostly worked on the printing aspects of this project. And it was Ren's idea to use fountain pen inks, mostly because we could buy them off the shelf and see if they work, because we weren't really sure how you could manufacture cut points to be at a specific point. But actually, I think this summer, I've recruited someone to work with me who has experience with these 10 to 12 ink printers. They have like experience I think they use it mostly for spectral reproduction for like fine art. And so in that case, I think I'd like to talk to more vendors about creating custom inks in this scenario. If you have any vendors in mind that you are thinking of, I'd love to hear the name of them. I guess I haven't done too much deep research into this myself.
I really, it's been so long since I've dealt with that I can't recall at this point.
That's okay, but thanks
But,
for
but what I was also wondering is that, is it possible that in our creation, they're creative designers who spend a lot of effort getting the right shade of colors in certain products and reproductions that they make. And is it possible that we are, by accident, without knowing it, there are some companies that are actually making something that would be more pleasant to look at for someone who has uh, um, the ability to see 4 different colors. And most of us can't tell the difference, but we have some sort of feeling, boy, that looks kind of nice, but we can't say why.
I don't think it would look any different to us as trichromats, but perhaps in the manufacturing of trying to get a particular shade, you may have, chanced upon, something like the 3-transition reflectances or something. Like in order to get like a good gray, for example, instead of reflecting all of the half, you reflect all of like S and Q versus like M and L in order to get gray, for example, that like, behaves well. That could be a possibility, but I'm not entirely sure. I would think that it's harder to manufacture like these 3-transition like function like stuff practically. But actually we had some. I just remembered like when we were working on this printing aspect more thoroughly, like I kind of transitioned to working on the projector. So the printing has kind of been on a back burner for a while. But I recall thinking that we found this gray ink that was a fountain pen ink that worked kind of like that looked kind of like a 3-transition function. And so actually that could be completely possible.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes, no, thank you.
Noel, would you like to ask your comment?
Oh, sorry, which comment is that? The linguistic aspects?
Yes.
That was just like something I'd heard that Russian speakers can have more of a gradation of different blues, just because starting as when they're a kid, they distinguish them with different words. It was just like something that was mentioned about some earlier with how we distinguish different colors.
Yeah. That I think that's, interesting to the overall point that color in general is very interdisciplinary, and so there are many aspects to study about it, just like how language, it's like, can you tell what a color is if you don't have a name for it? And I think that applies in the tetrachromatic case as well. Um, yeah, it makes you wonder, like, if you take a Crayola palette or something and you measure the spectral reflectances of it, since there are so many different shades in it, um, not sure how each of the pigments is made, even. Like, perhaps there would be interesting colors in there that we wouldn't know otherwise.
Oh, you said you were inviting people to your lab to uh, look at the projected image and see if you could detect um, um, the Q color. Where's that located?
Oh, this is in Berkeley.
I mean, is it on campus or just somewhere in Berkeley?
Oh, it's on campus. Uh,
And
yeah.
maybe you can post some contact information on when you might be available for people to stop in.
Mm. Yeah, so actually to go into this a little bit more, we're interested in women who have potentially a colorblind father or a color anomalous father. So in order to become tetrachromatic, you need the amino cones from like the maternal side and then the paternal side, and you want them to be different. So you want like a regular L cone from one parent and then an anomalous L cone from another parent. And so typically if a female's like father is colorblind, then they might be able to be tetrachromatic. So that was actually how the first study found the tetrachromat. Actually, she had two sons, and one of her sons was normal, and then the other one was an anomalous color anomalous individual. And so that's like another way to identify if someone may be tetrachromatic, is if their children are normal and colorblind. So whenever we finalize the IRB and everything to be able to recruit individuals. Um, these will be the type of people that I'll be looking for. But of course, I don't want to suppose that you have to have children in order to come do the test because that would be unnecessarily restricting a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah. Do you perhaps know anyone that would be interested?
I have a relative who lives near Berkeley who's an artist,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering if she sees something that the rest of us can't see. Um, I'll talk to her to ask her about her parents and colorblindness.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you could also just ask them about their own perception as well. Before there wasn't a very clear theory on what colors people see, but since we've done this work, we could just ask someone, do you think you see like colors in a sphere as opposed to a circle that's ordered? But yeah, ask them and see if they'll be interested in coming. I mean, I'd love to just test anyone that may be interested.
Sure.
Yeah. Any last questions?
Yesterday, ACM had a talk about using AI in drug discovery and such. Is there something that could be used that might either look at how the range of vision might be expanded, or the receptions, or even how might what genetic changes might help get different range, so you could start searching for other chromosomes that um, might affect that.
Mm. So the Knights lab at UW, they previously did like gene therapy in order to insert like an L cone into a dichromatic monkey, and they found that they were able to pass tests. And so they're using that in order to cure color blindness, for example. And I believe that they're currently trying to make a monkey tetrachromatic in order to see if one of their gene therapies will work. Um, so that's kind of like a side tangent of how this is, I guess, relevant in that space.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, perhaps thank Jessica. I guess if we wish we were live, so we could all clap. But thank you very much, Jessica, for coming to our chapter meeting. I think it was a very exciting night, and I mean we had a pretty good, nice discussion tonight. So I think we all really enjoyed it and learned a lot, something from you. And yeah, so good luck with your research, and yeah, if you have more, but perhaps come again, give more, presenting to us again. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you.
everyone.
Okay. Good night, everyone.